Hello, my name is Todd Wallace. I'm a student at George Washington University, and this afternoon I'll be providing a quick presentation on a comparison between the 1995 Tokyo sarin nerve gas attacks and the 2001 anthrax mailings in the United States. This is in support of a class in emergency management and crisis communication. In the latter part of the 20th century and early part of the 21st century, saw the world exposed for the first time to the first use of chemical and biological weapon of mass destruction in modern times perpetrated by a non-state actor against a civilian population. World War I, of course, saw the widespread use of chemical weapons, especially mustard gas, in the battlefields and trenches of Eastern Europe. But the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway in '95 and 2001 anthrax mailings in the United States represented distinct and extraordinary events as they targeted civilian populations during peacetime using a biological or chemical weapon. Both the 1995 Tokyo attacks and the 2001 anthrax mailings challenged immensely the emergency services of the society that the attacks targeted. This presentation will attempt to draw a comparison between these two vastly divergent and idiosyncratic attacks, as well as the unique circumstances in how each attack was carried out and responded to, and how each could be prevented in the future. In this comparative analysis, we'll focus on four key areas: the weapon and dispersal methods, the perpetrators and their goals, the intended target, and the emergency response. The weapon and dispersal method, now when we think of these two attacks, the obvious first comparison is the use of a chemical or biological weapon to carry out the attack. In the Tokyo attacks, sarin gas, a nerve agent classified as a chemical weapon, was used or was released into the air on board several subway cars during the peak morning rush hour. Sarin gas doesn't occur naturally in the environment, but rather it is a man-made chemical first designed by Germany as a pesticide in the early 1930s. When this liquid is released into the air, it turns into a vapor or gas, and even an extremely small amount can be deadly if inhaled or exposed to the skin. In the anthrax mailings, the perpetrator also used a fairly common biological weapon to target the victims. Anthrax, however, does occur in the natural world, and is extremely deadly when inhaled or exposed to the skin. The anthrax is purposely mailed in seemingly innocuous letters, with no visible warnings or indication of its deadly contents on the outside. Both perpetrators designed their delivery method with the intention of releasing as much of the poisonous contents as possible. Neither the sarin gas nor the anthrax, however, were weaponized. That is to say, they were not aerosolized to increase their dispersal capability. In the Tokyo attack, the Aum Shinrikyo scientists and engineers would of course preferred and actually did attempt to weaponize the sarin they used in the attack, but were unsuccessful in developing a vehicle necessary to aerosolize the gas. This forced the group to use a much more rudimentary method by puncturing sealed bags containing the sarin liquid. This, of course, limited the nerve agent's effects and reduced the overall number of casualties. In the anthrax mailings, whether or not the anthrax spores were actually weaponized became a highly politicized controversy in the early stages of the response and investigation. If the anthrax spores were in fact weaponized, a much more daunting task than that of sarin, it would have indicated, some theorized, the involvement of a nation state such as Iran or a non-state actor such as Al-Qaeda, especially following so closely on the heels of the September 11, 2001 attacks. Many in the national security apparatus of the United States initially considered the possibility of the mailings being the second wave of terrorist attacks. As it were, it was later scientifically determined to not have been weaponized. The anthrax spores were simply placed inside envelopes which were carefully sealed so as to release the deadly substance when opened by an unsuspecting victim. The next area we'll look at are the perpetrators and their motives or goals. Perhaps one of the most significant differences between these two attacks lies in the individuals responsible for carrying them out. In one attack, a multi-member organization divided into several operational cells carried out the highly coordinated attack. In the other, a single, highly skilled and educated scientist engaged in a lone wolf attack. In the Tokyo attacks, an ultra-religious fanatical cult whose leader viewed himself as the reincarnation of Christ, hell-bent on bringing the end of times, unleashed the deadly Sarin attacks in hopes of causing mass chaos and instability. The Amrum Shinrikyo group had an estimated 40,000 members and recruited highly educated members from the best universities in science, physics, and engineering, who were essentially disaffected and looking for dramatic ways to influence the world around them. 5 attack teams comprising of an attacker and a getaway driver coordinated attacks on 5 separate trains within a span of less than 90 minutes. In the Anthrax attacks, nothing could be further from the truth. There were no groups, no organization, and at least as near as the government has determined, no organized conspiracy. The United States government believes the single perpetrator, Dr. Bruce Ivans, acted alone. While there were plenty of potential suspects, nearly 400 at one point, it is contended by the U.S. Justice Department that Ivans grew and harvested the anthrax from his lab at Fort Detrick and mailed all the letters using the U.S. Postal Service. There were never any direct evidence, however, such as DNA or eyewitness testimony that actually implicated Ivans, which has further promulgated ongoing suspicion that others were involved. Bruce Ivans didn't belong to a larger concerted effort nor a conspiracy. He acted alone for reasons that he took to his grave. It was speculated that he carried out the attack not intending to cause harm, but rather to highlight the nation's need to take and prepare for an anthrax attack more seriously. Ivans' alleged goal in the attack was also self-serving. By causing mass panic over the threat of anthrax cases, his position and career would never be in doubt again. Other key differences between the attacks was the likelihood of success versus the likelihood of compromise. It is believed that nearly 200 Amrum Shinrikyo members were actually involved in some way in the Tokyo attack. The plan of the attack required large numbers to ensure success. However, with this many individuals knowledgeable of the attack, there was a high risk of compromise or implication of involvement in the attack. The attack was also dependent on several members following through. In the anthrax attack, however, only a single perpetrator was involved who didn't have to depend on others and with much less risk of compromise. An important similarity between these two attacks is the perpetrators in both attacks were highly skilled academics who had years of experience. Most of these individuals in the Tokyo subway attack who actually released the sarin nerve agent were either highly skilled doctors, scientists, or engineers. Bruce Ivans was considered the foremost expert in America on anthrax and was actually a consultant to the FBI in their Amerithrax investigation. Finally, the perpetrators were not suicidal in their objectives. All of them, even Ivans, who ultimately did commit suicide, intended on surviving the attacks. The Tokyo subway attackers all had getaway drivers to ensure they could escape the effects of the sarin nerve agent, as well as the police. In at least one case, one of the perpetrators, believing he was inadvertently exposed, actually went to the hospital for medical treatment. Many of those involved were on the lam for several years and vigorously disputed their involvement and tried to appeal their death sentences. Even Ivans had vocally proclaimed his innocence for a decade before finally committing suicide prior to the Justice Department indictment against him. The goals were also vastly different between these two attacks. And the stark differences exist in the ideology and motivation. For Amrum Shinrikyo, the cause is a rather common amongst radical religious extremist groups, which makes it easier to comprehend much more nowadays than it was over 20 years ago. The motivation for the group's attacks served its long-term goals and ideology. But for Ivans' attacks, The reasons and motivations are a little bit more complicated to figure out. Perhaps that's because Ivans himself was a complicated and troubled individual. It is highly unlikely that we will ever know definitively what the purpose of the anthrax mailings were. It seems hard to accept that it was simply intended to merely as an exercise to teach the government officials to take the threat of bioterrorism seriously. This leads us to the next comparison, and that is the intended target. While both intended to attack geographically separated targets, that is, Anrum Shinrikyo targeting multiple trains and stations, and Ivans targeting multiple people throughout the United States, significant differences exist in the types of the intended targets of the two attacks. In the Tokyo attacks, the Anrum Shinrikyo's group targeted indiscriminately, and its focus by targeting or attacking the public mass transit system and its private citizens became the victims. In this regard, the group did not really care who was killed. Like many terrorist attacks, the victims were not the government or the military, but rather ordinary citizens that may very well have been like-minded or actually supported or are actually supporters of the group. This did not matter. The group simply wanted as many casualties as possible to achieve its goals. In the anthrax attacks, the intended targets were ostensibly the individuals the letters were addressed to, i.e. congressmen and media figures. However, whether Ivans was truly targeting these individuals remains a mystery, as he should have known and likely did know that the innocent or unintended victims, i.e. the mail handlers, would have actually been the ones resulted in being injured or killed. It seems inconceivable that Ivans thought that a senator or even Tom Brokaw would have actually opened their own mail. And while he left clear warning instructions advising those who opened the mail to treat themselves with Cipro, he had to know that there would be casualties. If we are to believe that Ivans did not actually intend to kill anybody, but simply to use the incident as a wake-up call, then why so much anthrax? Why was he willing to risk ordinary citizens like mail handlers? Ivans was one of the nation's leading experts on anthrax, how it reacts in the environment and how to treat it. So it seems even more inconceivable that he wouldn't have known that the anthrax would have leaked out of the envelopes regardless of how well he sealed them. The amount of anthrax contained in the letters was so much and so volatile that it contaminated the entire mailbox in which it was deposited. So who was the real target? And therefore, what was his real intent? The answer to that question will likely never be known. Finally, in our last item of comparison, the emergency response to both incidents. In terms of emergency response, both incidents challenged and overwhelmed the local and national authorities who had previously never experienced such a biological or chemical attack. And both incidents resulted in heavy criticism and political pressure. Tokyo transit authorities were criticized for failing to connect the separate incidents fast enough, and in one incident, despite evacuating the train and conducting a search, failed to find the second of two sarin packets left by the group unopened. Transit authorities, not realizing the magnitude of the incident or the cause of the casualties, treated the sarin packets they found as regular trash, discarding them and mopping the floor afterwards. The trains were also initially put back into service, potentially causing more victims because the transit authority didn't communicate, although they knew there were more victims because there would be multiple casualties. As the event progressed, emergency services failed to recognize the type of the attack and the extent of the victims. They were criticized for inadequate response in their treatment of the injured. The police and security services were also lambasted in the media for not preparing for such an attack or adequately monitoring the group despite its previous involvement with sarin attacks, including one that killed 8 people 9 months prior. In the anthrax mailings, the initial emergency response was far more effective. Emergency services knew immediately what they were dealing with, in part because of Ivan's own warnings in the letters. Fairly quickly, all the letters were isolated. More importantly, the facilities from which they were processed were identified and closed for decontamination. Postal workers were put on Cipro as a precaution, and by the time the first victim died, a authorities had a good understanding of the magnitude of the attack and how to respond. The differences also extend to cleanup and restoring normal operations. The Tokyo authorities responded and successfully restored train service within hours to most train stations. This went a long way in helping the community and the victims recover from this horrific event. For the anthrax incident, however, cleanup and recovery would take much longer. Mail facilities were shuttered for many months before being allowed to reopen. While the Tokyo authorities identified and located the majority of the individuals involved in the sarin gas attack within 2 days, the anthrax investigation lasted more than a decade. And unfortunately, with Ivan's suicide, no one has ever been prosecuted for the crime. While the victims of the Tokyo attack have some closure, those that were victimized in the 2001 anthrax mailings don't have the benefit of a conviction, and with the amount of controversy and the inconclusive narrative surrounding the case, only the passage of time will aid in their closure. That concludes my presentation on the comparison between the 1995 sarin nerve agent gas attack in Tokyo and the 2001 anthrax mailings in the United States. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.